Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. Now, we spoke with Time Out specialist Judy Joseph McSween about conversational intelligence some time ago, and looking at the nature of conversations that we have swirling around with local government elections, and in addition to other things, we think it's high time that we have another discussion on conversations in our society. How you doing, ma'am? It's been a while.
Good afternoon, DK. Glad to be here as always. Good afternoon to our viewers.
And like I mentioned local government elections. So there are these instances, situations in society, and sometimes you feel the tenor of conversations changing a little bit. If we were looking at the quality of conversations in our society, do you think it really kind of facilitates collaboration from where you sit?
I want to take off from where we left last time when we were speaking about healthy and unhealthy conversations. So just to remind those who may have listened to that segment, and for those who are joining us for the first time, the neuroscience of conversations is that when we speak with each other, there are actually neurochemicals secreted into our system. That's the reality of it. And depending on the quality of the conversation, we can either secrete chemicals called testosterone, cortisol, that stimulate the amygdala hijack, that puts us into a very defensive, aggressive, or shut down sort of a frame, or we can have conversations that stimulate oxytocin, dopamine, and really puts us into a frame of mind where we're looking forward to collaborating, co-creating, we peaceful, we focused, we analytical, we creative, we innovative. So, and you can distinctly identify the types of conversation that stimulate the conversation of which set of chemicals. So if we were to look first of all at those conversations that stimulate dopamine and oxytocin, it would be conversations where people feel included. When I feel included, my energy level goes up, I feel happy, I feel at peace, and I want to talk to you. I want to engage you. I want to share ideas with you. Conversations that allow us to discover new things. Those are the conversations that stimulate oxytocin, dopamine. Conversations that, really allows me to express myself and not feel judged. So all those sorts of conversation facilitate what you spoke about in terms of collaboration. But if it is that the conversation we're having drives me into a space where I feel excluded, then my amygdala becomes triggered and the cortisol and testosterone start coming into my system. If it's a conversation where I think that I'm being severely and wrongly criticized, that stimulates cortisol. If I'm being judged and judged unfairly, that stimulates it as well. If it's a conversation where apparently you are the sole expert in the room, that stimulates cortisol. It's a conversation where I have no say. So you understand then how just by the mere words that we're exchanging, you can put me into a frame of mind where I'm co-creative, I'm collaborative, or you can put me into a frame of mind where the sole thing I'm focused on is defending myself. The sole thing I'm focused on is probably demeaning you and becoming very aggressive with you. Or I just shut down and I move away, fight, flight, or freeze.
But how much of that is the conversation itself versus nature and nurture of an individual? Because there may be something that is a trigger to an individual that is just run of the mill to someone else. So it may say more about that person and their experiences than the nature of the conversation. And even looking at the fact that there may be some conversations that are hard conversations, but they have to be had. So in terms of like the need for conflict, and like there's the saying, is only when breeze blow you see fall boomsy. So being able to pull apart some of those layers, but do we run from those conversations? Do we try to deal with ourselves before having those conversations, or even is that something that's even possible to do?
So let's start a bit with that nurture. And this is why it's difficult, or I shouldn't call it difficult. This is why you shouldn't segregate emotional intelligence from conversational intelligence. Because emotional intelligence allows me to appreciate the other. And therefore, if I'm seeking to build a relationship with the other, and I think part of our assumption here is that people are seeking to build relationships, then I'm more conscious of the things that trigger them. And then I am able to pause, become aware, and make a choice of how I communicate what I'm going to communicate. The other thing you raised is that whole area of conflict. And whenever we talk about conflict, you also hear in the same sort of space that, you know, I like to say what I want to say, and I'm blunt, and people figure that, you know, I can say whatever I want to say, how I want to say it. But again, what is the intention? And so when we have conversations in society, we need to be very conscious and intentional as to whether it is we want to build relationships or whether our desire is to create fracas, conflict, division, fear, anxiety. And there's some very basic tenets of a good quality conversation. If I'm really going into a conversation to build a relationship, the first thing I do is I prime the environment for trust. Okay. So where I meet with you is important. The layout of the room is important. How I begin the conversation is important. You know, as we began this evening, a simple, you know, how you're going, Judy, was enough to, you know, help to allay any anxiety I may be having. So how do you create the environment that the person feels comfortable to start the conversation? So priming for trust. Priming for trust could be in terms of agreeing, why are we here? All right, because I might think you pulled me in here to rake me over the coals, or I may think that you want to come out with a particular decision. And, you know, it's an assumption until I ask you and the fact emerges. So clarifying expectations is one way of priming for trust. And understanding, and I mentioned this last time, that trust is not something, it's not a one-off action. It's an ongoing ongoing action. So throughout the conversation, I need to test whether, in fact, this conversation is still about two people trusting each other and moving towards building a relationship. The other tenet of an essential of demonstrating conversational intelligence and building relationships is listening to connect. All right? So let me try and understand where you are at, rather than coming into this space full of what I want to address, and recognize that it's about us. So it's that awareness that building relationship is not just about me, it's about us. All right, what do you want? What do I want? And how do we get to there? If the conversation is predominantly about I, then we're not really building the relationship. Listening to connect is really being able to see what is resonating for the person. Where is the person's pain? You know, so that if I know that this is the source of your pain and I am able to address it, I can address it. But if I'm not listening to you and not connecting with you, I miss that. Trust falls apart. The other piece is we assume we know what the other has said. And what helps us really to get the clarity is when we ask further questions. You know, computers give us a good way of getting to the depth of things. So you click once and a menu comes up. You double click on it and more comes up. And essentially that's how conversations need to go. That you say something and then I double click on it to get a better understanding of the context, because context is important in a conversation, or an expression of what do you feel around this? You said this, but what is your thinking around it? What is your emotion around it? And then sometimes we go into conversations and we know the answer we're looking for. So it's worthwhile ever so often to ask questions that we don't know the answer for. And that encourages both ourselves and the other person to go into an exploratory mode. So what about, what if, and exploring possibilities and opportunities that we didn't come in with, because we're talking about collaboration and co-creation, and that's what facilitates it. And then it's also the recognition, and I would have mentioned this before, that you have to be open when you go into a conversation, open to be influenced by what you've heard. Because if your intention is, I went in with this and I'm leaving with this, then the opportunity for collaboration is diminished. And then, sometimes we have conversations and they go in fine, and then somebody says something and there may be silence in the room, and then you continue, maybe as if the person didn't say it. And so the ability to sustain the energy, the agility of the conversation is also an important competence to have, so that you can break that silence or break that tension or break that decline in energy by asking, what would make you say that? What were you thinking? What if? So those are the 5 essentials of somebody who is going into a conversation with the intention of building a relationship. The question I suppose we need to ask ourselves is, when we look at conversations in our society, do they reflect that?
And on that point, we take a short break. We're going to let that breathe for a second. And it's funny how there's such an abundance of things to say when you're talking about conversation. But we return with more after this. Welcome back. We are on a journey of discovery looking at conversations. We're doing so with Time Out specialist Judy Joseph McSween. And one of the things that you said in terms of listening to connect really resonated with me. And it made me think of 2 things. One, that a conversation is always a dialogue of power. And who thinks they have more power than who, whether or not that's real, whether or not that's perceived. And that leads into someone else sharing with me that access usually requires acknowledgement. Because if I don't see you, if I'm not listening to you, okay, well, I'm just waiting for you to say your piece so I can say what I have to say, because what and it goes back to that I was speaking about, because the I is more important than whatever objective you may have at this point in time. So looking at some of those dynamics, I want to introduce another dynamic in terms of sociocultural nuances. There may be something that is very germane to me, something that may be foreign to you. And one of the things I'm also looking at, I guess I'm packing it up, so we will do it piece by piece, increments as you want, is where do we get our references from? I heard a lot more people starting to speak with accents that sounded kind of like the TV during the period of the pandemic. I call it a Nickelodeon accent sometimes. So in terms of how does that help with understanding, with conversations, and especially if there may be different generations. So, people like to talk about them young people, what they're talking about. Them to them old people, boy. So it happens both ways. So what are your thoughts on any of those? Lay them out.
So let me talk about the accent, because we're talking about conversational intelligence as a means of building a relationship with the other. So irrespective of what accent you speak to me with, whether you're Trinidadian with an American accent, Trinidadian with an African accent, an African with an African accent, when I engage you, the basics that I need to build that relationship are fundamental. I need to be able to demonstrate emotional intelligence, and I need to be able then translate what I'm receiving from you into words that demonstrate conversational intelligence. So you could bounce my car, and I could jump out of my car and say, "You bounced my car." All right. And that may automatically put me on the defensive. So I may start telling you a tale about, no, it's not me, you did the wrong thing. Or I could come out of my car and ask, what happened? All right. A different energy, a completely different energy. And we don't realize how much power we have in conversations by how we choose to frame what we have to say. We just speak. We don't do that pause to ask what the impact is going to be.
And is that a bit of co-creation? Because sometimes it feels as though we are who we are, but being who you are sometimes can hinder you from being who you can be. And is that level of going into a conversation or even going into an engagement with someone, because no words may be said as yet, and it boils down to that energy that you're talking about. Are you willing to put yourself out there to meaningfully engage with that person?
Yes. And I think, as I asked before, in our society, when we talk about every creed, find an equal place, and together we aspire and together we achieve, is that really what we want? Because if we ask ourselves that as we're about to engage the other, then it would guide us differently. And there is a dissonance, I would say, that exists. And this is my favorite, between what we know, so some of us are very spiritual, some of us we opened in the church door every morning kind of thing. And there's a difference between that knowledge and who we are, and we essentially supposed to be all good people. So when you talk about what we can be, we can all be good people. And then what we do, how we speak. So if we're really connecting with our higher selves, we would pause and have a conversation that leads to the building of the relationship rather than the deterioration of the relationship. Dike, there's a newspaper that I glanced the headlines for and a couple paragraphs from it. And I think there's not a week that goes by where the verb that is used to describe a conversation is slam. This person slammed this organization, or they slammed this person. And just that word slam can be a trigger. It can be a trigger for the person who may have said whatever it was. It could be a major trigger for the person who received the words. And then it could be triggers for people who support either party, the person delivering or the recipient. So just noting, and I wonder in the culture of that particular media house, whether they are aware as to the impact. But then again, we go back to, what is your intention? Is it to cause fear? Is it to cause excitement? Is it to cause sales, or is it about building relationships?
And in terms of those relationships, I want to step back a little bit, because you use that word trigger. And so when I say step back, I mean from not necessarily national at this point in time, but a one-on-one conversation. A switch for a trigger has been flipped, and cortisol and some of these things are building up. Is that all is going to be, or are there ways to kind of dial back so that, yes, some of these hormones are coursing through bodies, but at the same time, we can use them in a manner that is more efficient and helps to get the job done. So it's not a matter of freeze, fight, or flight, but we can have it change to something else.
So the visual I like is the visual of the cocktail. So the oxytocin and the dopamine are one side of the cocktail, color it green. The testosterone and the cortisol are the other side, color it red. And so how do we balance that mixture? The quickest way for somebody to increase their oxytocin and dopamine levels is to pause and take a deep breath. Because recognize when your amygdala is triggered, what is happening. Your heart is beating at a rate, your breath is short, your muscles are tensing, you might be becoming sweaty, etc. And so if I were to take some deep breaths, I literally put that into reverse. My heart rate goes down, my breathing becomes more controlled. I'm shifting now from that primitive side of the brain to the prefrontal cortex of my brain. I'm more centered, I'm more focused, I'm aware as to what is happening in the present moment. You know, and I ask myself, if when we go into some of our hallowed halls, you know, when we look at conversations that go on in Parliament, you know, what is the intention when we go there? What makes us get into that shouting match? If we are practicing those 5 conversational essentials, where if our intention is not to demean, it's to include, it's to listen, you know, how might the atmosphere be different if we were to demonstrate that emotional and conversational essential or conversational intelligence in those spaces?
And you say that, and even though it brings us to the end of the conversation, it reminds me of the song, "You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one." But we want to thank you very much for the time, Judy Joseph McSween, and also looking at the fact, just taking that pause, taking that time out to be our better selves. We want to thank you for sharing that time with us. And on behalf of the entire TTT News team, this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant. Thank you so much for joining us.